Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on assessment. So kicking off with Sean Goodman, Terry Gleave, basically looking at don't go chasing the marks.
Thank you. Hi everyone, welcome. So I am Sean and this is Terry, and we are basically a double act from Liverpool that are going to talk to you today about something that would strike terror into many a person that is far better than myself. Actually not looking at marks, and actually looking at encouraging engagement and reflection in feedback practices. So if I'm going to bore you now with all of the pedagogy and all of the background to assessments and feedback, I'm so sorry, but I'm not. I'm joking. I'm going to bypass all of that because we all know why it's so important to us. There we go. So the question at hand is basically, if we decide to separate the marks away from feedback, can we start to encourage engagement? And can we, most importantly, start to encourage students to look at their feedback and begin to reflect upon it, which I think in biosciences is a really important process. We have looked at a staff perspective previously. I'll cover a little bit of this at the end because I'm sure we all have very, very different reasons why feedback is so important, and also why our students don't necessarily begin to engage and why they do go straight to the marks. But we want to focus primarily on what we did, the technology, and how we began to integrate it to actually look at this assessment and feedback approach. So it was a two-pronged process, and Terry will talk about it in a little bit more depth in a moment. But primarily, the first part looked at withholding the mark. So taking that away for the starting point and actually getting the students to focus on their feedback. That was more of a data-driven active research approach. And then, of course, we had the actual feedback provision side. So once the students delved into what was provided, how actually could they begin to understand this and integrate it into their own practices? And I think, as Phil said from Learn Science, most importantly is the constructive and timely nature of feedback and also building confidence. And that is what we strove to do with this.
Cheers, mate. So what we actually did was, it wasn't very innovative in any particular way other than separating the marks from the feedback. The biggest challenge was working within our VLE to actually achieve that as seamlessly and reduced workload for us and for the students. And so in its most simplistic pathway that we've got, we had the students submit their assignment to Canvas. Now, this first assignment was a group work assignment. It was a scientific report. And the idea is the class that we did it on was a practical class of about 170 students. And so we wanted to be able to get feedback to the students as quick as possible. But if that was at an individual basis, with 5 of us marking, it was going to be a challenge. So we went with a group assignment, working on the ability for the group to collaborate, as we would in an authentic way, and then for them to submit that assignment to us. They submitted it to Canvas, which is absolutely fine, but then there is no opportunity, there is no simple radio button within Canvas to say, reveal feedback and hold back the mark. Now, we did a lot of research on this, and the Canvas community seems to have been asking for this, what is now, for 8 years. It's not obviously going to come very quickly, is it, if it's not already arrived? So we worked within Canvas, and Sean worked out that you could create a copy assignment. It wouldn't copy the submission over, but what it did is it mirrored the submission of the student. So actually what we were able to do is mark the assignments as normal, provide the feedback on their submission, but put the mark on the dummy assignment, which was hidden from the students. So it meant it was simpler to then go reveal feedback, but not the mark. What it allowed us to do then was complete the marking as we would have normally, then let the students have their feedback within 3 days of submission. We weren't marking that many reports at the time, okay? Sometimes I think when we had the 170 individual reports, it took us 10 days, but we were able to reveal the feedback before the marks, and it allowed us time then to a moderation on the marks and to make sure everything was in order before the students got those. It then meant that the students could engage with the feedback, look at it, use it for preparation as we want them to do for additional assignments. We provided them with multiple levels of opportunity for engagement with the feedback, one of which was the rubric that we used for the marking as a Canvas quiz. Gave it to the students to say, right, you've read your feedback, complete the quiz. You tell us now what you think your work is worth. That was met with differing levels of engagement. The fastest was 7 seconds. The longest is still going. And there was this perception that as soon as they completed the rubric quiz, their mark would be revealed. No, never, not in a million years. But there were quite a few, too. Kiran will show you the data for that. And then we also asked them to give us a reflection on what they thought of their feedback. So that there were a couple of different levels that they could engage with the process. So then this is what we see for our first assignment. So remember, this is for the group assignment. And what we've done is compared our 2020 data, all taken from Canvas Analytics, and compared it with our 2021. The blue line is our first run, so that's where marks and feedback were given together. And then the red line is where the separation is. And what we can see is an engagement with the feedback. I must say that we took this as being on the feedback page for more than, I think it's 15 seconds. The reason we did that is the way Canvas works is it has a lot of pre-call-ups as it's pulling pieces of information ready to be accessed, but they were all much shorter in duration. So we took a meaningful interaction with feedback to be at least 15 seconds of access, and the majority of them were much longer than that anyway. But primarily, we can see early engagement with feedback when it was first released with the mark, but then very little engagement later. Okay, there's a small spike towards the end, kind of around 40 days, which we've subsequently found actually aligns with a similar assignment on another module, which was quite nice to see that they were going back to a scientific report in another practical, actually to look at the one they got the feedback from first. When we separated the marks from the feedback, so the red line, then I don't really have to say much more, other than you can see all the spikes where they would go back and have a look again and again. And again, we saw this phenomenon in the next module.
So for the second assignment, now this is the individual assignment. And the primary benefit of this, as we said, was to get that turnaround of feedback so much faster to the students. But actually, again, we can start to see that increase in engagement. And actually later at later dates. So a subsequent module, Life 227, has a very, very similar scientific report aspect to it. And actually, for this assignment the year before, you can see that very, very limited amounts of students, almost negligible, went back and revisited. Whereas at least 10–15% of the students did actually go back for this assignment to start to use the feedback and start to say, how can I apply this to other areas? And for us, that was incredibly beneficial to see, because it is something that we had tried to drive, not just that initial engagement, where they're beginning to go back and look, right, well, how does my feedback interlink to my mark? But also, now how can I use this? How can I apply it as I start to go down the line, both within this semester and we hope kind of for longevity into future years as well. So again, it's just a kind of summary. If we put them over the top of each other at the bottom, you can see where the peaks clearly align. As we have that release of the marks, students are revisiting, and again, for subsequent modules as well. And I think what is really nice is the fact that we begin to see other deadlines, for instance, a poster assignment, which traditionally would have very, very little to do with what we would ask from a scientific report. Some of the elements did cross over, and they were beginning to go back and revisit and say, actually, how does this feedback apply to other assessments that might not even be of a similar nature? So for this work, around about 150 of the students out of our 170 were able to look at the analytics. So it's from a reasonable sized cohort, but this is just the start. In our essence, it's almost a pilot that we began to begin with, and we plan on rolling this out again this year, hopefully next year, to see if we get that continuation of the revisiting and the engagement.
So what did the students think of it? How many actually took part in the other elements of reflection? There were about a 50-50 split of those that took part in the quiz rubric element of reflection. So you're looking at about 70, 75 students bothered to do the rubric, and the other half obviously didn't want to engage in that way. Their perceptions, no, sorry, this one we
It's okay. So what did they think? Actually, they all thought that it was pivotal to their learning experience and that feedback actually improved them as individuals. And this was both for assignment 1 and for assignment 2. And actually, what had they done with the feedback? Well, the majority had read it more than once, which was superb. This is great, and this is what we wanted to see. And very, very few, only for assignment 2, I think it was 1 or 2 students, said they hadn't read it at all. So actually, we'd begin to see that they were thinking about that. And obviously, this data isn't comparative to the years before because we didn't have the questionnaire, but actually the driving force forward, it was really great to see.
Yeah, the only sad thing from that was, as with everything else, the level of engagement with the survey was much reduced. But thankfully, we've got the other data which supports the way the mechanisms worked. Just trying to get what they feel and think about it is much more difficult. And so then we've got the other elements of the student feedback questionnaire. I don't expect you to read through all of them. I'm certainly not going to go through all of them. But essentially what we saw was this kind of almost this move to the left where they were in agreement. They could see the value of feedback, why it should be there, that it was value for them, and that it worked well for the ones that are engaged with it. Okay, so we're quite pleased with those that engaged. You could argue, but the ones that engage were always going to engage anyway. But the data is what it is.
And just when you all think that we've reached that holy grail, we've separated marks and the students all loved it, not quite. As you can see, there was quite a split between it. Those that really thought it was beneficial and those that absolutely hated it. And some of that is reflected in our thematic outcomes, primarily focusing around the anxiety that it may have induced, the fact that there was additional stress between seeing their actual feedback, going through it, and not necessarily being able to associate it with a mark. So there is still that drive there to the marks, the marks, the marks. And that is something that we, as ourselves, and I think as a wider group of institutions, have to begin to look at.
Yeah, and staff found it quite useful with that separation. We marked as a team, but we marked as a team online together to get that level of calibration as well. So the marks were as together as leveled as you possibly could be. Staff perception of the workload for those marking, it made no difference. It was just 2 windows. Our level of the organisation, please Canvas, just put a button in, will you?
So I will skip through all of the pedagogy because, as I said, we all know that it's pivotal, deeper learning synonymous with engagement, and the fact that we need that constructive level for students. And that's why we all strive to give the best feedback and make sure our students do engage. But also some of the staff perspectives, a lot of it focused around the process, the fact that it was there to give students indications of how they were doing, but most students would only use it for that sole purpose of what is my mark.
The interesting thing with the student perspective on the feedback as well, with the group assignment, anecdotally talking to some of the students, they say, well, there really wasn't much on my bit. It was a group output and you read the whole group feedback. You know, no, just the bit that I did. And I said, no, please go and have a look at all of it and then apply that. And once we had that discussion, then yeah, we saw kind of students that were very literal converting over to looking at more of the feedback that was provided.
So just some brief kind of reflections on what we found, that actually it is possible to increase the feedback and the engagement with feedback. And we were able to do it in a very timely manner to give effective feedback to the students. The way that we did it, which is some other methodologies that I'm sure we'll talk about hopefully in the future, we were able to reduce that need for mediation. And as well, because the students had their feedback, we felt there was a lot less coming to us, actually criticizing, rather than seeing the mark and saying, you know what, this is my mark and it doesn't reflect my feedback. The fact that they've taken time to take it in, digest, when they got their mark, we felt they were a little bit more understanding of it, which was incredibly beneficial. But again, the biggest issue that we found, not just the students' dislike, but is the VLE. And as Terry said, if Canvas do something, it'll make our lives a heck of a lot easier.
Any of all of the BLEs, please do something.
So just as the very final point, we did do some comparisons of the actual attainment levels. And what we can see is from the left-hand side, if we look at those from the first assignment that did not interact with any of the reflective practices, we get a baseline of where the students were at. So those that weren't likely to engage were around about 55% on average. What we can start to see as we build through each of the assessments and then onto further assessments is actually the more interaction with either the quizzes or, most importantly, the reflective practices actually did significantly increase the attainment or the marks for these assignments. Again, this is just from the pilot output from this initial module, but we hope that we can continue this and begin to see similar trends that will bode really well for the work that we've put in so far. So, brilliant. Thanks very much, everyone.
Hey guys, thanks very much. A couple of questions there. Then on Padlet. Is the feedback provided within 3 days tailored to the individual students, or is it generic?
It's tailored. So it was tailored to the assignment. There was no kind of inadvertently there ended up being a series of copy pastes because we generated a document within a shared document on an OpenDrive of the markers. When we did our first 3 assignments together, we'd pull all of the comments into one, okay, and we'd actually color code them slightly different side each other. But then it was able, as you were going through these common areas, to be able to pull what you would perceive as generic comments in. But then we also wanted for the actual report, if there was any additional comments, tailored into the report. So that was for the groups, and then similarly for the individuals as well.
There's another question here. How did students like predicting their mark, and did you consider providing any carrot for students to take this seriously?
We no carrot. That we literally wanted it to be, if you want to do it, do it. We said there is value to aiding your learning, but it is entirely up to you. We wanted to see what their buy-in would be. As to whether they enjoyed it or not, we can see from some of the reflections, some of them took it seriously. Some of them, like the 7 seconds individual, it was, I deserve 100% for everything. Yeah, thank you very much. And it's, no, you don't. And so there was different levels of client, as there is with different levels of engagement.
And I think interestingly, what we did find is those students that were more engaged tended to mark themselves a lot lower. Yeah. So almost that element of self-confidence, which we hope was something the feedback would provide them with, but actually it may have come across a little bit more critical. So as the next generation, that's something that we are looking at.
Just one quick question.
Did you find that your feedback was different, knowing that it's going to be read independent mark?
To be honest, no, we've kind of set up the same structure of the way that we would provide feedback the year previously. So it's kind of from another bit of a project that myself and Terry have worked on. So it was quite, the similarities were quite distinct between the two, which I felt was nice for comparison. But no, I wouldn't say there was any major differences.
No, the way we look at feedback is it can be that turning point, and it can either demoralize a student and really turn them off, or you can give that element of, well, this isn't right, or this is an area for improvement, or well done. And we try and give that balanced level of feedback, not just all the hypercritical. And so we've been doing that for a little while, so that we try to maintain that balance because of the way we provide feedback.